The air was thick with the kind of heat that clings to your skin, the kind that makes you crave the cool relief of a quiet house after a long day. I'd just gotten back from a late yoga class at the community center in our little suburban corner of Charlotte, North Carolina, a place where everyone knows your name but not your secrets. My muscles ached in that good way, the kind that reminds you you're alive, but my mind was restless, buzzing with thoughts I didn't want to face. I kicked off my sneakers by the door, the hardwood floor cool against my bare feet, and made my way upstairs to the master bedroom. It was my sanctuary, a space I'd carved out in this house I shared with my husband, David, and his son, Connor. The room was all soft creams and deep blues, with a king-sized bed piled high with pillows and a big window that looked out over the oak-lined street. It was the kind of place that felt like it belonged in a Southern Living magazine, but tonight, it felt like a stage for something I couldn't quite name. I dropped my yoga mat in the corner and peeled off my sweaty tank top, tossing it into the laundry basket. The mirror on the dresser caught my reflection, a woman in her mid-30s, with dark hair pulled into a messy bun, my skin flushed from exercise and the summer heat. I wasn't the same girl I'd been 10 years ago, but I still turned heads at the grocery store, and I knew it. Maybe that's why I felt a flicker of something reckless when I thought about being alone tonight. David was out of town, off at some corporate retreat in Raleigh, and Connor, his 20-year-old son from his first marriage, was supposed to be at his girlfriend's place. The house was mine, and I relished the quiet, the freedom to let my guard down. I slipped out of my leggings, standing in just my sports bra and underwear, and reached for a silk robe hanging on the back of the door. That's when I heard the front door creak open downstairs. My heart skipped, a sharp jolt of adrenaline cutting through the calm. I froze, listening, my fingers tightening around the robe. The house was old, built in the 70s, and it had a way of making every sound feel like an announcement. Footsteps echoed on the hardwood, slow, deliberate, not the hurried shuffle of someone who belonged. "David?" I called out, my voice softer than I meant it to be. No answer. I pulled the robe on, tying it loosely, and stepped toward the hallway, my bare feet silent against the floor. The air felt heavier now, like it was holding its breath. I was halfway down the stairs when I saw him, James, David's best friend since college, standing in the living room like he owned the place. He was tall, with that rugged charm that made him look like he'd just stepped out of a whiskey commercial, dark stubble, broad shoulders, and eyes that always seemed to know more than they let on. He was holding a bottle of wine, a grin spreading across his face when he saw me. "Hey, stranger," he said, his voice warm and teasing. "Didn't mean to scare you." David said I could swing by to grab some tools from the garage. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding, my hands still clutching the banister. "You could have texted," I said, trying to sound annoyed but failing. There was something about James that always put me at ease, even when I knew it shouldn't. He laughed, setting the wine bottle on the coffee table. "Thought I'd surprise you. Looks like I succeeded." His eyes flicked over me, taking in the silk robe that barely reached my thighs, and I felt a flush creep up my neck. I should have gone back upstairs, changed into something less revealing, but I didn't. Instead, I stepped into the living room, the robe slipping slightly as I moved. "You're lucky I didn't have a baseball bat," I said, crossing my arms to hide the way my pulse was racing. James just grinned, stepping closer, his presence filling the room. "I'd take my chances," he said, his voice dropping to a low, playful tone that sent a shiver down my spine. We'd always had this thing. A flirtation, maybe, or something more dangerous. It started innocently enough, jokes at barbecues, lingering glances when David wasn't looking. But lately, with David gone more than he was home, those moments with James had started to feel like something else. Something I couldn't admit to myself, let alone anyone else. I told myself it was harmless, just a way to pass the time, but standing there in my living room, with the house so quiet and James so close, it didn't feel harmless anymore. "Want a glass of that?" I asked, nodding toward the wine, my voice steadier than I felt. He raised an eyebrow, like he knew I was stalling, but he didn't call me on it. "Only if you're joining me," he said, already moving toward the kitchen to grab glasses. We sat on the couch, the wine bottle between us, the air thick with something unspoken. I sipped my drink, the Merlot warm and rich on my tongue, and tried to ignore the way James's knee brushed against mine. We talked about nothing, work, the weather, the new brewery downtown, but every word felt loaded, every glance a little too long. I could feel the heat of him, the way his laugh made my stomach flip, and I knew I was playing with fire. But I didn't stop. I leaned closer, letting the robe slip just a little, letting the moment stretch until it felt like it might break. And then I heard it, the front door opening again. My heart lurched, and I turned toward the sound, my wine glass nearly slipping from my hand. Connor stood in the doorway, his backpack slung over one shoulder, his dark eyes narrowing as they took in the scene. Me, in my barely there robe, sitting too close to James, the wine bottle half empty on the table. "Connor," I said, my voice catching in my throat. "I thought you were at Mia's." He didn't answer right away, just stood there, his gaze flicking between me and James, something unreadable in his expression. "Yeah, well, I'm here now," he said finally, his voice low, almost accusing. And in that moment, I knew this wasn't just a misunderstanding. Something was about to change, and I wasn't sure I was ready for it. The room felt smaller now, the air charged with something I couldn't quite name but could definitely feel. Connor was still standing in the doorway, his backpack hanging loosely from one shoulder, his eyes locked on me and James. The wine glass in my hand felt like a prop, something to hold on to as my mind raced to make sense of the moment. I should have stood up, laughed it off, made some excuse about James stopping by to grab tools and staying for a drink. But my body didn't move, and my voice stayed silent. Connor's gaze was heavy, not just surprised but something else, something that made my stomach twist in a way that wasn't entirely fear. James, for his part, leaned back on the couch, his arm draped casually over the backrest, like this was just another Friday night. But I could see the tension in his jaw, the way his fingers tightened around his glass. He knew this was bad, even if he wasn't showing it. "Connor, I didn't hear you come in," I said finally, my voice coming out shakier than I wanted. I set my glass down on the coffee table, pulling my robe tighter around me, suddenly hyper-aware of how little it covered. The silk clung to my skin, and I could feel James's eyes on me, even as he pretended to look at Connor. "I thought you were staying at Mia's tonight." I was repeating myself, stalling, trying to fill the silence that was growing heavier by the second. Connor dropped his backpack to the floor, the thud loud in the quiet room, and took a step inside. "Plans changed," he said, his voice low, almost too calm. His eyes flicked to James, then back to me, and I felt a flush creep up my cheeks. There was no mistaking the way he was looking at me, not like a stepson, but like someone who'd seen something he wasn't supposed to. James cleared his throat, setting his glass down with a deliberate clink. "Hey, man," he said, his tone easy but forced. "Just stopped by to grab some stuff from the garage. Your dad said it was cool." He was trying to play it off, to make this seem normal, but Connor wasn't buying it. I could see it in the way his shoulders tensed, the way his hands flexed at his sides. "Yeah?" Connor said, his eyes still on me. "Looks like you're making yourself at home." There was an edge to his voice, sharp and accusing, and it sent a shiver down my spine. This wasn't just about James being here. This was about me, about the robe, about the way I'd let myself lean into James's orbit, knowing full well it was a line I shouldn't cross. I stood up, my legs feeling unsteady, and forced a smile. "It's just a drink, Connor," I said, trying to sound casual, but my voice betrayed me. It was too high, too defensive. James was just leaving. I shot James a look, hoping he'd take the hint, but he didn't move. Instead, he leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, and looked at Connor with a grin that was almost challenging. "No need to rush off," he said, his voice smooth, like he was daring Connor to make a scene. I wanted to scream at him to shut up, to not make this worse, but my throat was tight, and my heart was pounding too loud to think straight. Connor took another step closer, his eyes never leaving mine. "You didn't answer my question," he said, his voice quieter now, but no less intense. "What's going on here?" I opened my mouth to respond, to say something that would defuse this, but nothing came out. Because the truth was, I didn't know what was going on. I didn't know why I'd let James stay, why I leaned into his touch, why I was still standing here in this flimsy robe, letting this moment spiral out of control. And worse, I didn't know why Connor's gaze was making my skin burn, why there was a part of me, a reckless, dangerous part, that didn't want to look away. "Connor," I started, but my voice faltered as he closed the distance between us, stopping just a few feet away. He was taller than I remembered, broader too, his presence filling the room in a way that made it hard to breathe. "It's not what you think," I said, but even I didn't believe it. James chuckled, a low, rumbling sound that broke the tension but not in a good way. "Kid's got a point," he said, standing up now, his hands in his pockets like he was enjoying this. "Looks bad, doesn't it?" I shot him a glare, my heart racing, but he just shrugged, his eyes glinting with something that wasn't quite amusement. I should have ended it right there, sent James to the garage, told Connor to go to his room, anything to put the walls back up. But I didn't. Instead, I took a step toward Connor, my hands trembling as I adjusted my robe. "It's just a misunderstanding," I said, but my voice was barely above a whisper, and I could feel the lie in it. Connor's eyes searched mine, and for a moment, I thought he might turn and leave, let this moment fade into an awkward memory. But he didn't. Instead, he reached out, his hand brushing against my arm, so light I could have imagined it. But I didn't. I felt it, sharp and electric, and it sent a jolt through me that I couldn't ignore. "Misunderstanding," he said, his voice low, almost a challenge. His hand lingered, his fingers grazing the silk of my robe, and I felt my breath catch. James was watching us now, his grin fading, replaced by something darker, more curious. I should have pulled away, should have said something to stop this, but my body wasn't listening. My skin was alive under Connor's touch, and I could feel the heat of James behind me, the air thick with something forbidden. "Maybe," Connor said, his eyes locked on mine, "but I don't think so." And then, before I could process what was happening, he stepped closer, his hand sliding up my arm, and I knew we were crossing a line we could never uncross. The air in the living room was thick, heavy with the weight of what was happening, what had already happened and what might still come. Connor's hand was still on my arm, his fingers warm against the silk of my robe, and I could feel James's presence behind me, his silence louder than any words. My heart was pounding, a wild rhythm that drowned out the rational part of my brain screaming at me to stop this, to step back, to put an end to whatever this was before it went any further. But I didn't move. I couldn't. There was something in Connor's eyes, something dark, intense, almost hungry, that held me in place, and James's quiet observation only made it worse, like he was waiting to see how far this would go. "Connor," I said, my voice barely a whisper, a plea for him to stop, or maybe for myself to find the strength to pull away. But his hand tightened slightly, his thumb brushing against my skin, and I felt a rush of heat that had no business being there. This was wrong, so wrong, but my body was betraying me, responding to his touch in a way that made my head spin. James stepped closer, his shadow falling over us, and I could feel his breath on the back of my neck, close enough to send a shiver down my spine. "You sure about this, kid?" he said, his voice low, almost taunting, directed at Connor but meant for me too. I wanted to snap at him, to tell him to leave, but the words stuck in my throat, caught in the tangle of guilt and desire that was twisting inside me. Connor didn't answer James, didn't even look at him. His eyes were locked on mine, searching, challenging, like he was waiting for me to make the next move. "You didn't push him away," he said, his voice soft but sharp, cutting through the haze in my mind. He nodded toward James, and I felt my cheeks burn. He was right, I hadn't pushed James away, hadn't told him to leave when he'd leaned too close, when his knee had brushed mine on the couch. And now, with Connor standing here, his hand on my arm, I wasn't pushing him away either. I was standing in the middle of this storm, letting it pull me under, and I didn't know why. I started, but my voice faltered, and I felt James's hand on my shoulder, light but deliberate, like he was claiming his place in this moment. "Relax," he said, his voice smooth, almost soothing, but it only made my pulse race faster. "No one's judging here." His words were meant to calm me, but they did the opposite, igniting a spark of something reckless, something I'd buried long ago. I should have stepped back, should have broken free from both of them, but my feet stayed rooted to the floor, my body caught in the pull of their presence. Connor's hand slid higher, his fingers brushing the edge of my robe, and I felt my breath catch, sharp and unsteady. "You don't want me to leave," he said, not a question but a statement, and the certainty in his voice made my stomach twist. He was right, and I hated it. I hated the way my skin tingled under his touch, the way James's hand on my shoulder felt like an anchor, grounding me in this forbidden moment. I wanted to tell them both to stop, to go, to let me pretend this never happened, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I leaned into Connor's touch, just enough to feel the heat of his hand, to let the moment stretch into something dangerous. James's hand moved to my neck, his fingers grazing the sensitive skin there, and I felt a jolt that made my knees weak. "You're not stopping us," he said, his voice low, almost a whisper, and I could hear the challenge in it, the invitation. I should have said no, should have pushed them both away, but my body was acting on its own, drawn to the heat of them, the way they were both watching me, waiting. Connor stepped closer, his body inches from mine, and I could feel the tension radiating from him, the way his breath hitched as he looked at me. "Tell me to stop," he said, his voice rough now, almost pleading, but his hand didn't move, and neither did I. I don't know how long we stood there, caught in this strange, electric dance, but it felt like forever. The room was silent except for the sound of our breathing, too loud in the stillness, and the faint hum of the air conditioning. I could feel the weight of what was happening, the way it was pulling us all towards something we couldn't take back. And then, before I could find the strength to stop it, Connor leaned in, his lips brushing against my ear, and whispered, "I want this." It wasn't a question, and it wasn't just about him. It was about all of us, about this moment that was spiraling out of control, and I felt my resolve crumble, replaced by something raw and reckless. James's hand tightened on my neck, pulling me closer, and I felt his lips against my temple, soft but deliberate. I was caught between them, my heart pounding, my mind screaming that this was wrong, but my body didn't care. I turned to Connor, my eyes meeting his, and I saw the same conflict there, the same desire, the same refusal to back away. And then, before I could think, before I could stop myself, I reached out, my hand brushing against his chest, feeling the rapid beat of his heart under my fingers. It was a small movement, but it felt like a surrender, like I was giving in to something I'd been fighting for too long. The moment hung there, fragile and dangerous, like a thread stretched too tight. My hand was still on Connor's chest, feeling the rapid thud of his heartbeat, while James's fingers lingered on my neck, his breath warm against my skin. I was caught between them, my body alive with a mix of fear and something else, something I didn't want to name but couldn't ignore. The living room, with its plush couch and half-empty wine bottle, felt like a different world now, one where the rules I'd lived by for years didn't apply. I knew I should pull away, should say something to shatter this moment, but my voice was gone, swallowed by the intensity of their presence, the way they were both watching me, waiting for what I'd do in EXT. And then the phone rang, a shrill, jarring sound that cut through the haze like a knife. I flinched, my hand dropping from Connor's chest, and James stepped back, his hand falling away. The spell was broken, but the air was still heavy, charged with what had almost happened. I stumbled toward the coffee table, where my phone was buzzing, David's name flashing on the screen. My stomach dropped, guilt crashing over me like a wave. "It's David," I said, my voice hoarse, barely recognizable. Connor's eyes darkened, and he took a step back, his hands shoving into his pockets. James just watched, his expression unreadable, but I could feel the shift in him, the way he was pulling back, recalculating. I answered the phone, forcing my voice to sound normal. "Hey, honey," I said, turning away from Connor and James, as if that could erase what had just happened. David's voice was cheerful, oblivious, talking about his retreat and how he'd be home tomorrow. I nodded along, murmuring responses, but my mind was elsewhere, replaying the feel of Connor's touch, the weight of James's gaze. When I hung up, the room was silent again, but it wasn't the same. The tension was still there, but it was different now, tempered by the reminder of the life I was supposed to be living. "I should go," James said finally, breaking the silence. He grabbed his jacket from the arm of the couch, his movements deliberate, like he was trying to reclaim some control. "Good to see you, Connor," he added, his tone light but strained, and I could tell he was trying to smooth things over, to pretend this was just a normal visit. Connor didn't respond, just watched him, his eyes flicking to me for a moment before looking away. I wanted to say something, to explain, to make this right, but what could I say? That it was a mistake? That I hadn't meant to let it go this far? The truth was, I wasn't sure what I meant anymore. James left, the front door clicking shut behind him, and then it was just me and Connor, standing in the living room, the wine bottle still sitting on the table like a silent witness. I turned to him, my hands trembling as I adjusted my robe, trying to cover myself, to cover the moment. "Connor, we need to talk about this," I said, my voice shaking. He looked at me, his expression hard to read, a mix of anger and something softer, something that scared me more. "What's there to talk about?" he said, his voice low, almost bitter. "You made your choice." His words hit me like a punch, because they were true. I had made a choice, not just with James, but with him, with that moment when I hadn't pushed him away, when I'd let his touch linger. I opened my mouth to respond, to say something that would fix this, but he was already moving, grabbing his backpack and heading for the stairs. "I'm going to bed," he said, not looking back, and I was left standing there, alone in the living room, my heart still racing, my skin still burning from their touches. The next morning, I found a note slipped under my bedroom door, written in Connor's messy scrawl, "We're not done." My stomach twisted as I read it, a mix of fear and something else, something I didn't want to admit. David would be home soon, and life would go back to normal, or at least, it was supposed to. But as I stood there, clutching the note, I knew nothing would be normal again. Not after last night, not after the way Connor had looked at me, the way James had pushed the boundaries, the way I'd let them. I didn't know what was coming, but I knew it wasn't over. And that scared me more than anything.